Hi, welcome to Organizing Life's Daily Demands. My name's Peter Gordon. I'm a daily money manager and president of New York Financial Organizers. We help people pay their bills, file insurance claims, and do all the non-investment side of personal finance, essentially organizing their life's daily demands. But just that one aspect of it. So the purpose of this podcast is to introduce people to other professionals who help in organizing life's daily demands. And today I'm really excited to talk with Jennifer Martin, who's a funeral director at Schwartz Brothers and Forest Park Funeral Homes. Morning, Jennifer. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
I think that people might be surprised to hear that I'm excited to talk to a funeral director, but I'm such a big believer in your services, and I've seen the difference it's made in not just my lives but other people's lives. So I am excited about talking with you. Why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Thank you. Yes. So I've been a funeral director for a little over 30 years. And when I was in college, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was kind of thinking social work or community relations. And my uncle passed away suddenly and unexpectedly at a young age. And I remember my aunt telling me that the funeral director made the worst day of her life worse. And that was sort of a turning point in my life. And I'm like, I bet I can do this better. And that was the direction I went. And I went back to finish my undergraduate degree and actually went back to school for mortuary science to become a funeral director. And I have lived and worked in my community for yes, over 30 years, and I love it.
That's a great story. I know my first experience with a funeral director was making plans for my father's funeral. And I was surprised at what a relatively seamless experience it was, because of the help of the funeral director. Nonetheless, I realized it could have been done much better, and that's why we're talking. So tell us about the thinking that goes behind planning a funeral.
Well, there's two ways to plan a funeral. You can plan a funeral once the person's passed away, or you can plan the funeral in advance. You can plan a funeral in advance when somebody's health is declining. You can plan a funeral in advance when someone is vibrant and healthy. So those are the three categories of funeral planning. The most stressful of those three is planning the funeral once the person has passed away. That is when you are grieving, you are sad, you are in shock. People always ask me, when people come, they say, "Oh, people are always crying in your office." I said, "No, people really don't cry in my office. They are just numb and in shock. And they don't cry in my office," which you would think people would. So if you're making funeral arrangements after someone has passed away, your head is in a fog. You're not thinking as clearly. You may be making emotional purchases. Emotional purchases
Exactly.
Bring up the funeral bill tremendously. But at the end of the day, that's how a lot of people plan funerals after someone has passed.
Would you say most people?
I'm going to say the majority of people plan funerals after someone has passed away, but the amount of people planning in advance is growing year over year.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a tremendous idea. Even if somebody is on hospice, I always recommend reaching out. Even if you're not pre-funding or prepaying for a funeral, just have a conversation to understand what the options are. because there are a lot of options, and sometimes people think that they have graves and ownership of graves, and we discover once we call the cemetery that somebody else is in that grave, another family member. So there's a lot of things that can go sideways, and you really don't want that last minute.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And my experience, is most of our clients are elderly, and we always talk about having a pre-planned and often prepaid service. Are there advantages of prepaying it?
So there are definitely advantages with prepaying. First of all, it locks in the cost of the funeral. So the funeral contract is divided into two sections: the funeral home's charges and third-party charges, other people's charges, clergy charges, cemetery charges, state certificate charges. So the bulk of the funeral will be the funeral home charges, and then you'll have the other charges. So when you prepay, you're locking in the funeral home charges. And then the money gets put into an interest-bearing account. And when the time comes, we take a look at what are the current charges for the funeral that day and how much money's in the account. And it's interesting, sort of depending over the years how the interest has been. There are some times when there is so much interest in that account that we refund the family money because we just have had too much money. And there are some times when there's not enough interest in the account because the interest's been low and the funeral prices go up every year. But that's our problem, not the family's problem. We've guaranteed the prices. And if I have to take off of the bottom line of the bill $1,000 on my side to guarantee what they've prepaid, that's what we do. The only thing that's not guaranteed is the cemetery. So cemetery, the cash advances, which are usually the cemetery. That's the bulk of it. So we apply the interest to that, so the family doesn't have to pay as much, if anything. So that is the biggest, I would say, financial advantage. Anyone who is applying for Medicaid, these monies don't go against them for assets. So if you're applying for Medicaid and you need to be spending down, you can prepay your funeral, your spouse's funeral, your sibling's funeral, your children's funeral. You can prepay any immediate family member to help you get closer to your Medicaid amount that you need to be.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I know about the individual. I didn't know about immediate family members. Wow.
Yes. And
Wow.
we'll see that every now and then where it makes sense to spend down. So and none of those prepaid dollars, because they're held in an irrevocable trust, count against the person for assets. So you have the financial advantage, and financial advantage is huge, but you also have the emotional advantage. So I always say there's 3 types of people who should prepay. People who don't have children should prepay. Because otherwise you're leaving this to extended family members or an executor. People who don't like their children should prepay. And people who really, really love their children should prepay. Because you're making the decisions that you want. You're not spending emotionally if you're planning for yourself. You're doing this in a thoughtful manner. You can, it's just, you're setting it up and taking the burden away from the children. We see all the time where I'll have 4 children, four siblings, the child of someone who's just passed away, and they're sitting around and they're arguing. They're arguing over what they're doing. They also start to argue over who's paying. Well, one of the kids has been out of work. The other one's wife is having medical issues. Then you got the one who lives in the big house on the island. So everyone looks to that one to say, hey, you've got the most money. You should cover this. The person who's passed away has lived a long, full life and doesn't really have assets. So, and then they argue, and it creates tension. So if in that scenario, if that person who had passed away had prepaid 10 years earlier and made those selections, we wouldn't have 4 children sitting, 4 adult children sitting in a room, upset, angry, resentful. So
yeah, well, that's great. also, what about planning the funeral itself? And we talked about this before. I had done another podcast with a friend of mine whose mother planned it all herself long before she passed away. And you were saying the importance of not just putting that in the will. Do you want to address that?
Sure. So yeah, so sometimes people will say, "Oh, it's in my will. Everything I want is in my will," or I've told somebody what I want, but sometimes you don't remember if you've been told. But the issue with the will is wills are often in safety deposit box, locked up in apartments. Who knows where the will is? The attorney has a copy. They don't know where their copy is, and it's the will's not read until after the funeral.
Exactly.
So if I've heard of very similar situations where people didn't realize that the desired funeral arrangements were in the will, and the funeral took place, and then they read the will and they didn't do anything that person wanted. Not a thing. I have a coworker whose grandmother had written everything that she had wanted in a notebook in her nightstand, and everything she wanted, down to the flowers, the dress she wanted, the music she wanted played, the clergy she wanted to officiate, and they found it when they were cleaning out her apartment. And again, in this situation, and they did a beautiful service for her, but nothing that she would have wanted. So
Yeah.
when you prepay, you discuss all of that. We keep a file that has the documents. It's not just about the money, but it's about what the person wants. Inscriptions on monuments. We recently had a gentleman who died, and he gave us 15 people he wanted us to call to advise that he had passed away. And he designed his own headstone and everything that he wanted. He discussed which shirt he wanted, which pants he wanted, where they could be found in his house, what he wanted to be buried with. So all of that was in his prearranged funeral file, and we were.
I didn't realize that you could have the funeral director, the funeral home, call people.
So that's not the norm, and not everybody would do that. I happen to have developed a nice relationship with this man for the prearrangements. So I did that because he did not have any. He had no family.
Right, but some family members might appreciate that also.
Yeah,
it's something to think about.
Absolutely. So, but everything that he wanted, he got because he shared it with us. We wrote it down, and he paid for it. So we've had people leave money to take people out to a restaurant afterwards.
Yeah.
People who have said, I want all the people in my senior center to be able to get there, so I'm going to provide for 4 limousines, so this way everybody can get to my funeral. So you have a lot of things that you can control when prepaying if you're doing it for yourself. And if you're prepaying for a family member, again, you can be doing this, perhaps asking your family member, well, what is it that you want, and how do you want this, and then making those decisions, looking at caskets, and not feeling like, I need to do this because I haven't been there for my mom or dad. So let's give them the nicest casket that we have. No, you don't need to do that. That's not. And when somebody's passed away, that's kind of sometimes how people think. There's all those emotions come up. But if you're doing this in advance and you're thinking clear-headedly, you're going to spend less.
Speaking of caskets, let's cover the issue of cremation versus burial.
Okay. So it's a very personal decision. So also religion-based. So, and also depending on where you are in your personal faith. The Catholicism did not allow for cremation for many years. They do now. You can bring a casket into a church that will then be cremated. You can bring ashes into a church for a mass, and that wasn't always that way. Judaism also says no to cremation. But the Reform movement and some of the conservative do now allow cremation. Same thing with Muslim. Muslim, if you are a practicing Muslim, you're not going to cremate. If you're not a practicing Muslim and you're completely secular, you can, you're going to do whatever you want to do. There are religions that are absolutely Hindu, absolutely cremates.
Yes, they do.
So it becomes a personal choice. There's sometimes people feel that they need to cremate because it's a better financial move, but it is not necessarily. And that should always be a discussion with the funeral home. If your feeling is to cremate for financial reasons only, there are always options to, if it's something that you really are not comfortable with, but you feel you have no choice, a funeral director can always help you find options for burial that are cost efficient. But yep. In fact,
Right.
cremation became popular after John F. Kennedy Jr. He was the one who died in the plane crash, right?
Yes.
Right. So he was cremated, and all of a sudden, it was interesting. People who'd never thought about cremation see this prominent, wealthy man who was cremated, and it's like, oh, okay, So that was an interesting phenomenon.
People are funny.
Yeah, it's good enough
Yeah,
for
no,
good enough for me,
right. I was surprised at my mother's request to be cremated, since we have a plot, and we also are Jewish, but that was her decision. And however, we worked it with our synagogue, with actually the synagogue I belong to, so we had a memorial service there, and it was wonderful.
Right. No, there's a lot of options, and even with cremation, you can go towards cremation as though it were a burial, where you have a full open casket, visitation, and then instead of going the next day to a cemetery, cremation takes place, or more commonly, where the cremation will take place first, and then a memorial service will be held afterwards. So
I want to touch on the benefit of pre-planning, is that it's one phone call for the family.
Correct.
The person passes away, you make a phone call, and everything just goes, as smoothly as you've directed. And and that, like you said, that I love what you said about how it could make the worst day of somebody's life worse. And so by pre-planning, it removes that.
So it's interesting. Sometimes we'll work with seniors who are pre-planning, and their kids are very much. So sometimes they're like, "Mom, why are you doing this? We'll take care of it." Those are the kids that, when the time comes, are like, "I am so thankful that she did this. I don't know how we could have made these decisions." And the reality is, we do make the decisions, and everyone goes to their final resting place. The question just becomes, how much stress is there between the time of death and that time. Before COVID, my mother-in-law passed away. She was 93, and she lived out of state. And you often have that the kids, one takes care of the parent and the other one does nothing. So we were kind of the one that did nothing, because we didn't live 10 minutes from my mother-in-law. And but I'm a funeral director, so spoke with my sister-in-law, and my mother-in-law was on Medicaid, and we prepaid everything. We got the phone call that it was going to be time soon, and my husband and I packed our bags and drove to Massachusetts, and got there just. They actually had said to my mother-in-law, "Oh, they're here," and then she passed away before we got to the room, which was nice, because I think that's what my husband needed. That it would have been hard for him to watch her slip away. And then I went into work mode, and I called the funeral home in Brookline, and I said, "Okay, we've got a pre-arrangement, and we want the funeral. They're Jewish. We want the funeral tomorrow," and we got it done. And it was, and everyone was like, "Wow, this went so seamlessly." And my sister-in-law was like, "I can't believe, like, we didn't have to do anything, just literally show up." And I said, "Yeah." I said, that's all you have to do when it's prearranged. That's all. You just have to make a phone call, drop off clothing, possibly. If the person, if there's, the specific clothing, again, depends again on the religion and what the needs are. But make a phone call, drop off clothing, and show up for the funeral. So Flowers can be selected in advance. I mean, everything can be selected in advance.
This is an interesting comment. From this conversation, I'm thinking about when my mother was ill and passed away, and she was in the hospital. And the rabbi visited us, and he said to me that, according to Jewish, tradition, that there's no time where you could be closer to God than if you're with somebody who's about to pass. And I'll never forget that. It was really meaningful. And that, and that's a big part of my memories from my mom. I have lots of different memories, but one of them is the end of her life, which was a beautiful experience for us because it was pre-planned.
Right.
Do you want to talk about kind of what funeral services look like nowadays?
So funeral services are evolving. They are becoming a little less traditional than they had years back. So years back, it was just very formal, very traditional. Even the way people came dressed to funerals, suits and ties and all dressed
I'm
up.
amazed at that.
So just I sort of remember even going to Broadway shows or flying on the airlines.
Flying. Yeah, you get it dressed up to go on the plane.
Go on the plane, and now you can go on the plane in pajamas and flip-flops. So we don't get pajamas and flip-flops to the funerals, but there's definitely a much more element of casual with the funerals. They're more relaxed in a way if that's what somebody wants. So we just I have funerals where we've had bands come and play music, violinists. There was somebody who was a member of a rock tribute band, and his people came and played. And actually, I think they played "Stairway to Heaven" as we left the chapel. Had an artist, and we brought in her artwork, and we displayed her artwork around the lobby, and you walked in and you just felt it was so personalized. You walked in and you knew her. You knew whose funeral you were there for, and it was just we've displayed sculptures. So that's all new. Personalizing a funeral is not something that was done 20 years ago. We do video montages, and that was something that at first I thought was sort of strange, but it's beautiful. And for us, we give the families a link. They can share it. People can upload photographs, and it's played before the funeral. And all the photographs, family, friends, and people are there, and they can celebrate. It's a celebration of life.
Talk a little bit about the Schwartz Brothers and Forest Park Funeral Home itself and the renovations that you've done.
Sure. So we've done a large renovation that started before COVID and took years to get done. So we have a large building in our funeral home. We actually have, in our one location, we have 4 funeral homes. We have 3 that are specifically Jewish funeral homes. That's Parkside, Sinai Chapel, Schwartz Brothers, and then we have Forest Park Funeral Home, which is our non-sectarian brand. Over the years, the Forest Hills community has changed, and the need for a non-sectarian funeral home has come where our neighbors are coming in and walking in and saying, "Hey, we're not Jewish, but we live across the street. Can you assist us with our funeral?" So the Forest Park brand allows us to do that with a dedicated website that doesn't talk about Shiva and Jewish things. And it does have links for flowers versus fruit baskets. So we've got the building is large and modern and beautiful. We even have a catering room, which was something that is relatively new. The law prohibited New York funeral homes from serving food up until just before COVID.
Wow.
Midwest, they've been serving food in funeral homes for years. We still can't serve liquor, but we can serve food. So we've got this room that looks like a catering hall. It's really quite beautiful, and people are always
very nice.
surprised. And after COVID, we really found use for that, because what we were doing is people who didn't have real burials with people attending, we were having memorial services and then going upstairs for a luncheon. And that was just really well received. So the catering room we'll use mostly for memorial services, or for Forest Park families who want to offer food during the visitation. So that's available, and people can bring their own food in, or we can provide. We have caterers that we work with, and it just sort of takes the burden off. You don't have to, go out afterwards, and you can provide whatever it is that you want for your friends and families when they get here. So we have 2 chapels on the main floor, larger, and a smaller chapel upstairs, which is where we quite often do visitations, and then the catering room. So we have a lot. We have a lot. And every funeral home under this roof has its own dedicated website. So if you've been a Schwartz Brothers family and that's meaningful to you, you're going to be a Schwartz Brothers family for your funeral. So that works well.
Well, that's great. And it's a great segue. So what we'll do is we'll put those links underneath in the text of both the podcast and the video.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much. As I mentioned, I love this topic because, it's one that was verboten for so long. And but it's so important to get educated about it and make these decisions while people are still alive.
It is so important. And yes, and it just, I happen to love what I do. I really, meeting with families, giving them the service that they want, and educating them. Because a lot of people, how many times does a person arrange a funeral in their life? Maybe once, maybe twice. So people who are coming in, they don't know. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know how to do it, and you need someone to direct you and guide you. And that's important. And I love educating people about options and guiding people and making the right decisions for each family, whether they want it super formal and traditional or they want a little wild and crazy celebration. We can do everything.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Jennifer, thank you so much. It was
Peter, so much.
This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
And so long, everybody. I'll see you at the next video, or hear you at the next, or you'll hear me at the next podcast. Take care.
Bye-bye.